December 24, 1945. The war had been over for months, but for the women inside the wire, peace still felt like an unspoken rumor. The night air at Luzon carried the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. Rows of barracks stood quiet beneath low lanterns, their wooden walls breathing out the cold. Inside, Japanese women, former nurses, clerks, wives of officers, sat on rough benches, wrapped in faded army blankets. No one spoke. Then, through the hush, came the sound of boots on gravel. American guards, young, exhausted, faces hollowed by the same war, entered the compound carrying boxes wrapped in paper. For a moment the women thought it was a drill, another inspection. But one soldier knelt and placed a small parcel on the floor. Soap, chocolate, a comb. A quiet confusion spread through the room. One woman pressed her hands to her face. Another whispered a word, nonsense, or maybe miracle. Outside, someone began to hum a tune the prisoners did not know, slow and solemn, carried by wind and memory. No one had expected kindness to survive the war. Yet here it was, wrapped in brown paper, smelling faintly of tobacco and cinnamon. By late 1941, Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. Its people were told that surrender was worse than death. From childhood, the Japanese were taught the creed of Bushido, the warrior's code, that one's honor was indivisible from one's loyalty to the emperor. To be captured was to bring shame not only upon oneself, but upon one's ancestors. In the Pacific War's early years, Japanese troops fought with a ferocity that shocked the West. At Bataan, Corregidor, and Singapore, Allied soldiers were marched for miles under a burning sun, beaten, starved, executed. Reports of atrocities, some true, others exaggerated, hardened American resolve. In turn, Japanese propaganda painted the Americans as beasts, desecrating temples, mocking the emperor, defiling women. By 1944, this hatred had become absolute. On Saipan, entire families leapt from cliffs rather than fall into Allied hands. At Okinawa, mothers killed their children with grenades to avoid capture. When the war finally ended in August 1945, it was not peace that followed. It was disbelief. For the Japanese, defeat was not simply a military loss. It was a spiritual collapse. The emperor's surrender broadcast, the first time his voice had ever been heard by his people, left millions weeping in confusion. Cities lay in ruins. Industry had vanished. Starvation crept into the countryside. And scattered across the Pacific were tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners, soldiers, sailors, and civilians who had been captured or had surrendered only when all other hope was gone. Among them were women, a few thousand across Asia and the Pacific, nurses captured while tending to the wounded, civilian clerks, wives of officers caught in retreat. Some had been evacuated from places like Guam or the Philippines. Others were detained in post-surrender roundups. Their fate was uncertain. For years, they had been told that capture by the Americans would mean humiliation, torture, or worse. Instead, what awaited them was something far more disorienting: humanity. The Americans who now oversaw these camps were not saints. They had seen the worst of the war. Men burned alive on Pacific beaches, comrades executed, civilians bombed. Many had come to hate everything the Japanese flag stood for. Yet military discipline and the newly reasserted Geneva Conventions required restraint. Commanders ordered their men to treat prisoners with fairness, partly to set a moral example, partly to avoid post-war scrutiny. At first, the relationship was one of mutual suspicion. The Japanese women avoided eye contact, bowed stiffly, spoke little. The Americans kept their distance, unsure whether to pity or despise them. Barbed wire and watchtowers stood as silent reminders that peace was not yet trust. But gradually, small gestures began to break the silence. A guard offering extra rations, a nurse tending to a prisoner's fever, a translator teaching English phrases. It wasn't compassion as policy. It was compassion as accident, born of fatigue, and the simple recognition that the war's cruelty had consumed too much already. By November 1945, as winter descended across the Pacific Islands, the camps began to change in character. The women were allowed to walk within the compound, to write letters, to receive visits from Red Cross inspectors. Some even volunteered to help in camp kitchens or infirmaries. It was then that the first rumors began, that the Americans were planning a holiday. To the Japanese, the idea was absurd. The very concept of Christmas, foreign, Christian, American, belonged to another world. But in the minds of the American soldiers, many of whom were only in their early 20s, the holiday was a fragment of home they refused to abandon. Some pooled their own rations. Others carved toys from wood or fashioned paper decorations from old supply ledgers. No one could have predicted that this small act, born in boredom and nostalgia, would become something far larger. A quiet collision between two civilizations that had spent years trying to destroy each other. And as December deepened, the camp at Luzon, dusty, fenced, half forgotten, became the unlikely stage for one of the war's most human stories. The camp at Luzon was not remarkable. It had been built hastily in mid-1945, when surrendering Japanese units began arriving from scattered garrisons across the Philippines. Rows of bamboo barracks sat on sun-baked soil, surrounded by wire and guard towers. The Americans called it Camp Number 14, though to the prisoners it had no name, only a silence broken by orders, footsteps, and the occasional cough that carried through the thin walls at night. Inside one of those barracks were nearly 80 Japanese women. Some had been nurses at field hospitals near Manila. Others were clerks, radio operators, or wives of officers who had refused evacuation. Many were still in their wartime uniforms, the insignia removed but the stitching marks still visible on their sleeves. Malnutrition had hollowed their faces. Most avoided mirrors altogether. The American garrison responsible for them belonged to the 25th Infantry Division. Young men drawn from Kansas, Texas, and Ohio, most of them counting the days until discharge. They, too, were weary of the war's debris, the endless inventory lists, the monotonous rations, the waiting for orders that never came. For them, the camp was both punishment and refuge, a place where nothing exploded anymore, but nothing truly lived either. Officially, these women were non-combatant detainees. In practice, they existed in a gray zone between enemy soldiers and refugees. American regulations mandated humane treatment, and inspectors from the Red Cross occasionally confirmed that basic needs were being met: food, medical care, sanitation. But the emotional terrain was more complex. The prisoners expected abuse. The guards expected hatred. Both sides found themselves disarmed by the other's restraint. When Christmas approached, the idea of holding any kind of celebration seemed absurd. The camp chaplain, a Methodist minister from Chicago, suggested a short service for the American troops, followed by an evening meal. But one sergeant, a 24-year-old named Thomas Keller, proposed something unusual. "What about the prisoners?" he asked. "They're human too, aren't they?" At first, the officers dismissed the idea. The war had ended only 4 months earlier. Many of these men had fought through Saipan and Leyte, losing friends to snipers and suicide attacks. The wounds were too fresh. But Keller persisted, reminding his superiors that the Army's orders were clear. All prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, without discrimination. Eventually, reluctant permission was granted, on one condition: the event would be small, discreet, and supervised. The soldiers began collecting what little they could spare: canned fruit, chocolate bars from care packages, soap, pencils, and scraps of fabric. Some wrote letters home asking for a few things for the Japs. Others carved simple ornaments from wood, painting them with leftover ration dye. It was not charity. It was, as one corporal later recalled, something to make the world stop feeling so damned broken. Meanwhile, the Japanese women watched in silence as the Americans strung wires and cleaned the mess hall. They did not understand the purpose. In their minds, Christmas had no meaning beyond what wartime propaganda had told them: a foreign ritual belonging to a decadent, materialistic West. To imagine that their captors would involve them in it was inconceivable. Yet, on the night of December 23rd, something changed. One of the guards, passing by the fence, paused to greet a group of women standing outside their barracks. He handed through the wire a small piece of chocolate wrapped in brown paper. The women hesitated, then accepted it. That gesture, unnoticed by the rest of the camp, was the spark that set everything in motion. By Christmas Eve, word had spread among the Americans. Tonight, the gifts go to the women's barracks. The chaplain prepared a short reading from the Gospel of Luke. The quartermaster arranged for candles, and somewhere in the confusion of orders and fatigue, the soldiers realized that this would not be an act of pity. It would be an act of remembrance. For those men, Christmas had always been about home, families waiting by fires, carols on radios, the smell of pine. For these Japanese women, it became something else entirely, a glimpse of a world that had not been erased by surrender. And so, as the final lanterns were lit along the camp's wire, two nations that had met only in fire prepared to share a moment neither side would ever forget. For months the camp had been defined by silence. The Japanese women moved in groups, speaking only when necessary, their eyes fixed on the ground. The Americans, unsure how to approach them, responded with equal reserve. The air between them was filled with invisible walls, of memory, of loss, of language. When the first gifts appeared on Christmas Eve, that silence broke. A bar of soap, a pencil, a piece of bread, objects so ordinary in peace, yet unthinkable in captivity. For the women, it was not the material value that mattered. It was the absurdity of gentleness from an enemy. Many wept without understanding why. One later recalled to a Red Cross inspector, "It was as if the war suddenly lost its meaning." For the Americans, too, the exchange struck deeper than expected. Most of them had seen combat firsthand. They remembered caves where surrendering soldiers detonated grenades, beaches strewn with charred helmets. To hand a gift across the wire was to challenge their own hatred. As one guard would later write, "You can't stay angry at someone who holds out her hands like that." That night, fear loosened its grip. It didn't vanish, but it began to dissolve, quietly, like frost in morning light. To understand why that Christmas gesture struck so deeply, one must look at what surrender meant in the Japanese mind. Under the military code of the Imperial Army, captivity was dishonor. A woman captured by the enemy was believed to have lost her purity and worth. Many of the women at Luzon had begged their officers to let them die rather than surrender. Yet fate had chosen otherwise. Their new reality, guarded, fed, and treated by Americans, was incomprehensible. These were men they had been told were demons, desecrators. The very act of being alive in captivity contradicted everything they had been raised to believe. When the gifts arrived, it was more than kindness. It was a rupture in identity. Accepting food or trinkets from an enemy meant accepting the idea that one's enemy could be human. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. Some women refused to touch the parcels. Others clutched them as if afraid they might disappear. On the American side, culture worked in reverse. The United States Army had fought a war of moral conviction. Good versus evil, as the propaganda had said. Yet here, in this small camp under the tropic sky, morality took a quieter shape. The soldiers began to see not enemies but people, small, fragile, as homesick as they were. What the textbooks later called humanitarian administration was, in truth, a spontaneous meeting of two exhausted civilizations, both learning to exist without hatred. The chaplain at Camp No. 14, Reverend Keller, had served in the Pacific since 1943. He had buried men in coral sand, prayed under bombardment, and once given last rites to both American and Japanese dead on the same beach. For him, Christmas in 1945 was not celebration. It was confession. He asked permission to include the prisoners in a short service. The decision was controversial. Some officers argued it was inappropriate. Others feared it would be seen as forced conversion. But Keller's reasoning was simple. "It's not about faith," he said. "It's about proof that mercy survived." That night, as the gifts were distributed, he read aloud from the Gospel of Luke. "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men." Most of the women did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. His voice trembled not with authority but with fatigue, the kind that only war could carve into a man's bones. Later, one of the women, a nurse named Aiko, approached him through the wire. In halting English, she said, "Your God. He forgive. Even war?" Keller, unable to find words, simply nodded. That brief exchange never made it into any report. But among the men who stood witness, it became a symbol that even in victory, compassion was not weakness. Emotion in the camp did not explode. It thawed. The night of the celebration, the women returned to their barracks with their small parcels, whispering softly. A few sang an old Japanese lullaby, something they had not done since capture. Across the yard, American soldiers listened in silence, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the dark. In that moment, two songs, one sung, one remembered, existed side by side, not in harmony, but in peace. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something quieter, rarer, recognition. For those who had fought, that night became a story retold only in fragments. For those who had suffered, it became the first sign that mercy could still breathe beneath ruin. For years, the Japanese population had been shielded from the human side of the enemy. Newspapers, radio, and school books portrayed the Americans as savage, mechanical creatures without honor or soul. That image had sustained the empire's morale through defeat after defeat. But inside the camps, where those monsters offered bandages and food, the illusion began to rot from within. At Luzon, this unraveling happened quietly. The women began to observe details that contradicted everything they had been told. American soldiers shared letters from home, photos of wives, drawings made by their children. They prayed before meals. They laughed easily. They wept when they spoke of friends who had not returned. For many Japanese women, this psychological shift was devastating. Their loyalty to the emperor had been absolute. Their hatred of the enemy, sacred. Now, faced with ordinary kindness, they found themselves lost between worlds, unable to hate, yet unable to accept compassion without guilt. A report by a U.S. Army psychiatrist in early 1946 noted that many Japanese prisoners showed signs of identity crisis. They no longer knew who they were, warriors, victims, or witnesses. The Christmas gift exchange accelerated that confusion. It was a symbolic shattering of the myth that morality belonged only to one side. Running a POW camp required balance. Too much leniency invited chaos. Too much strictness bred rebellion. The American officers at Camp Number 14 understood this well. Most were veterans of combat units, accustomed to authority forged through violence. But here, leadership took a different form. Quiet order built on fairness. Captain Robert Hayes, the camp commander, kept a handwritten rule pinned to the wall of his office. "We can win twice. Once in war, once in peace." He understood that how his men treated the prisoners would shape the world they returned to. The Christmas event tested that philosophy. Some soldiers resented the idea of giving gifts to former enemies. They had lost friends at Guadalcanal, at Leyte, in the skies above Tokyo. Yet Hayes insisted. "We are soldiers," he told them, "not avengers." His order was clear. No mockery, no favoritism, no forced gratitude. The gifts were to be offered quietly, with respect. And when the evening came, he stood beside the chaplain as his men distributed the parcels. Not as conquerors, but as witnesses. Leadership, in that fragile moment, meant restraint. It meant proving that discipline could coexist with compassion. For the prisoners who watched from their barracks, it was the first time they saw authority without cruelty, command without fear. The Christmas exchange at Luzon carried no military significance. No treaties were signed, no strategies changed. Yet symbolically, it was one of the earliest expressions of post-war reconstruction, the beginning of something that would later define the U.S.-Japan relationship. The wooden cross at the camp's entrance became a meeting point that night. The Americans lit candles along the fence. The Japanese women, curious but hesitant, stepped closer. There was no common language, but gestures replaced words. Nods, bows, Faint smiles. A soldier held up a small paper star. A woman pressed her hands together in silent thanks. In the weeks that followed, the story spread among nearby camps. Other American units began organizing similar gestures, not as orders, but as imitation of decency. One general in Manila later wrote, "It was the first time I realized the occupation would succeed, because our men had learned to be kind." The symbolism of that Christmas went beyond religion. It was about the reintroduction of humanity into a world that had forgotten it. When the war began, both nations had dehumanized the other to survive. When it ended, they had to relearn what it meant to see faces again. The women at Luzon would later describe the night as impossible. One remembered how a guard offered her a bar of soap with both hands, as Japanese custom dictated when showing respect. Another said she kept the small pencil she received until her death, not as a souvenir, but as proof that decency could exist in unexpected places. Psychologists, later studying post-war reconciliation, often cited events like the Luzon Christmas as micro-moments of moral reconstruction. These were points where soldiers and prisoners unconsciously began to rebuild the framework of trust that the war had obliterated. For the Americans, giving gifts was an act of reclaiming their own humanity from the savagery of battle. For the Japanese, accepting them was the first step toward understanding that defeat did not mean moral extinction. In the quiet that followed that night, the camp changed. Guards spoke more softly. Prisoners began to greet them. The fences remained, but they no longer divided two species, only two nations learning to coexist. The war had been fought to exhaustion. What remained now was the slow, invisible labor of peace, and it began, improbably, with a few soldiers and a handful of small wrapped gifts under a foreign sky. Christmas Eve, 1945. The sky above Luzon was a dull silver, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and kerosene lanterns. Within the camp, the usual night routine had been suspended. No roll call, no curfew whistle. The guards moved quietly between the barracks, their boots crunching softly on gravel. Inside the women's compound, the barrack lamps flickered against thin wooden walls. The prisoners sat in silence, uncertain why the lights were still on past dusk. A murmur spread down the line of bunks. Something is happening. Some assumed an inspection. Others feared new orders. Then came the sound of music. It began faintly. A harmonica, clumsy but heartfelt, playing a melody none of the women recognized. Silent night. The tune drifted through the compound, carried by wind and distance. The women looked toward the window slats, where the glow of lanterns grew brighter. Moments later, the gates opened. A line of American soldiers entered, led by Chaplain Keller and Captain Hayes. They carried wooden crates, stacked with parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. No rifles, no shouting, just the shuffle of boots and the low hum of a Christmas hymn. The women stiffened. Some bowed instinctively, others turned their faces away. For months, they had learned to show obedience without expression. A mask for survival. But this scene did not fit into any known ritual of command. The chaplain stopped near the center of the yard. He cleared his throat, his breath visible in the cool air. "Tonight," he said, voice low but steady, "we share peace. Not as nations, but as people." Few understood the words, but tone alone carried their meaning. A soldier stepped forward, opened the first crate, and handed out parcels one by one. The women hesitated. Their hands hovered between fear and disbelief. When one finally accepted a small package, wrapped with care, something fragile shifted in the crowd. Inside the parcels were simple things: bars of soap, handkerchiefs, candy, combs, pencils, small notebooks. Some contained small folded notes in English. "Merry Christmas. Peace to you. For a new beginning." The women could not read them, but many would keep those scraps for the rest of their lives. The silence grew thicker, then cracked, not with applause but with quiet sobbing. One woman covered her face, tears staining her uniform. Another whispered softly in Japanese, "They have hearts after all." A third reached out impulsively, touching the sleeve of the soldier who had given her a parcel. He froze, then bowed, awkwardly, but with sincerity. From the guardhouse the harmonica played again, this time joined by a faint chorus of male voices. The song had no rhythm, no harmony, just the trembling sound of men who wanted to believe that something good could still exist. Captain Hayes watched from the edge of the yard, his jaw tight. He had lost a brother on Iwo Jima. For him, this night was not forgiveness. It was defiance, a refusal to let hatred dictate the rest of his life. As the last parcels were handed out, Chaplain Keller stepped forward again. He looked at the women, their faces lit by the lanterns, and said, "Peace is not a gift we give. It's something we choose not to take away." One of the Japanese women, a nurse named Aiko, the same who had once asked him about forgiveness, knelt and bowed deeply. Then others followed, not as submission but as respect. The Americans, uncertain, responded with nods and soft smiles. Beyond the fence, a church bell rang faintly from a nearby town, perhaps from an American chapel, perhaps from a Filipino village. Its sound rolled through the humid air, mingling with the voices and the flicker of lanterns. For a brief moment, the war was truly over, not in speeches or treaties, but in the quiet recognition that both sides had survived the same fire. That night, some of the women placed their gifts beneath their pillows. Others hid them in tin boxes, afraid they might be taken away by morning. The Americans returned to their quarters without speaking. None of them would ever forget the faces they saw through the wire, faces that no longer looked like enemies. Outside, rain began to fall lightly, hissing against the lanterns. It washed the dust from the camp roads, softened the scent of rusted wire, and carried away the last ash of war. The next day, Christmas morning, the camp would awaken to something unseen but unmistakable, a different kind of silence. Not fear, not resentment, but something that felt almost like peace. Christmas morning. A faint mist hung over the camp, turning the sunlight into a pale blur. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving puddles that mirrored the barbed wire and the rising steam of cooking fires. For once the bugle call did not sound. The camp stirred to life slowly, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace had descended in the night. The Japanese women emerged from their barracks holding the small brown parcels from the night before. Some carried them pressed against their chests. Others opened them carefully as though expecting them to vanish. The smell of soap and chocolate, foreign, sweet, unreal, filled the morning air. Across the yard, the American soldiers gathered for their own meal. Their Christmas rations were meager: tinned ham, powdered eggs, a few cigarettes, and coffee thick as mud. Yet there was a strange, quiet satisfaction among them. No one joked, no one complained. They simply ate and watched the women on the other side of the fence, who were doing the same, unwrapping biscuits, sharing candy, examining the strange treasures of peace. One soldier, Private Miller from Ohio, scribbled a note in his pocket diary. "They smiled today. Not much, but enough to make me forget Saipan for a while." Later that morning, Chaplain Keller returned to the compound to check on the women. A few of them bowed as he entered. One offered him a small piece of cloth, a handkerchief she had embroidered with a red thread pulled from her uniform. The stitches were uneven, the pattern crude, but the intent unmistakable. On it, she had sewn a single word in Roman letters she barely understood. "Thanks." Keller accepted it with tears he didn't bother to hide. Nearby, an American photographer named Sergeant Daniels, attached to the 25th Infantry, quietly raised his field camera. He took a few stills. The women gathered around their gifts, the soldiers leaning on their rifles, the chaplain standing between them. Those photos would later appear in an obscure U.S. Army newsletter titled "Faith Beyond Victory." Few at the time paid attention, but decades later, historians would rediscover them as some of the earliest visual records of humane interaction between former enemies in the Pacific Theater. In Washington, official policy was already shifting toward reconstruction. The occupation authorities under General Douglas MacArthur had issued guidelines. All Japanese POWs were to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. But in the field, Interpretation of humane treatment often depended on individual commanders. At Luzon, it had taken the shape of Christmas. Reports from the International Red Cross corroborate the existence of small celebrations like this one in late 1945 in the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa. The Red Cross noted with astonishment that many prisoners, especially women, were receiving gifts and letters from American soldiers. Some camps even allowed limited correspondence with families in Japan. It was an experiment in empathy conducted within barbed wire. For the Japanese captives, the event triggered emotions they could neither express nor fully comprehend. Some recorded their thoughts later in journals and testimonies preserved by Japan's Ministry of Health and Welfare. One entry, written by a nurse named Michiko, read, "They gave us sweets. I could not eat. My throat closed. I had hated them for so long. I wanted to hate them still. But I could not." Another wrote simply, "If our soldiers had shown such mercy, maybe our emperor would never have needed to bow." The moral shock ran deep. These women had been taught to view compassion as weakness, mercy as treason. Now, in defeat, they encountered both, and it felt unbearable. Many broke down days later, not from hunger or illness, but from the emotional weight of having been treated as human again. That afternoon, Captain Hayes ordered that the prisoners be given a short walk outside the main compound, an unprecedented gesture. Under guard, they stepped through the gate for the first time in months. The sunlight felt strange on their faces. Some stopped to touch the grass, as though it were something they had forgotten existed. The Americans stood aside, rifles slung but muzzles down. No one spoke. The women bowed slightly as they passed, not as subordinates, but as survivors. For Hayes, the moment marked a quiet victory. Not military, but moral. "If they can see us without fear," he wrote in a report to headquarters, "then perhaps the next generation won't need guns to understand each other." That evening the camp returned to its routine. The fences were still there, the rules unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. The prisoners no longer averted their eyes when addressed. The guards stopped calling them Japs and began using their names from the manifest list. The chaplain's Sunday services were attended by both Americans and a few curious Japanese women who wanted to hear the songs again. For a war that had devoured millions of lives, this change seemed small, microscopic even. But every peace begins that way, with gestures that mean nothing on paper and everything in the heart. In later years, when the occupation of Japan became one of history's most successful reconstructions, men like Hayes and Keller were seldom mentioned. Yet in the moral architecture of post-war recovery, their kind of leadership, quiet, disciplined compassion, was the first foundation stone. The Christmas of 1945 at Luzon was not a celebration. It was a surrender of another kind, not of nations but of hatred. And when darkness fell that night, the camp lay under a strange calm. Somewhere beyond the hills, church bells rang again, carried faintly by wind. This time, both sides heard them the same way. Not as the sound of the enemy's faith, but as proof that the world, though broken, was learning to forgive itself. By the spring of 1946, the camps across the Pacific began to empty. Ships bearing the faded markings of war now carried passengers instead of soldiers. Thousands of Japanese prisoners returning to a homeland they barely recognized. Among them were the women of Camp No. 14 at Luzon. Their departure was quiet. No speeches, no music, only the sound of boots and wooden crates on the pier. Each woman carried the same ration bag, a Red Cross tag around her wrist, and one small personal item allowed by the Americans. Many chose to bring the same gifts they had received that Christmas. A bar of soap wrapped in paper, a notebook, a comb. To anyone else, they were worthless trinkets. To those women, they were proof that compassion had survived the war. The Americans who had guarded them stood in a silent line as the women boarded the transport. Some saluted, others simply nodded. Captain Hayes shook hands with the Red Cross representative and left the dock without ceremony. He had written his final report the night before, a meticulous summary of food stocks, medical inspections, and conduct. But at the end of the document, he added one personal note. "In this camp, the enemy ceased to exist. We were all just tired humans trying to remember how to be decent. The ship's engines rumbled to life. As it pulled away, a few of the women gathered at the railing, bowing toward the shore. None spoke. One quietly held up a folded piece of cloth, the same embroidered handkerchief she had given the chaplain. It fluttered once in the wind before vanishing into the mist. Back in Japan, the return of female prisoners was met not with celebration, but with suspicion. The stigma of capture was powerful. Families were often too ashamed to welcome them openly. The government offered little assistance. In official records, many of their names were listed only as repatriated personnel. Yet the women carried stories that refused to fade. Some found work as nurses or teachers in the ruined cities of Osaka and Tokyo. A few wrote letters, never published, but preserved in archives, describing the Christmas night that had changed them. One of them, the nurse Aiko, would later testify before a Japanese university research panel in 1964. Her words were simple. "We thought mercy died in the war, but it was given back to us by those we feared the most." Her account drew little public attention, but it circulated quietly among historians studying Japan's social reconstruction. It was one of the earliest first-hand Japanese testimonies describing humane treatment by American forces, a small but vital counterpoint to the overwhelming narrative of defeat and humiliation. On the American side, records of Camp Number 14 were folded into the broader administrative files of the Pacific Command. The Christmas event was mentioned only once, in a Red Cross addendum titled Non-Standard Morale Activities, Luzon Sector. It described the exchange as a minor but symbolically valuable humanitarian act. For the soldiers who had been there, it was not minor at all. Private Miller returned to Ohio in 1946 and rarely spoke of the war. But among his belongings, his family later found a folded camp photograph, grainy, faded, showing a group of women holding small packages beneath a wooden cross. On the back he had written only, "Luzon, Christmas 45. The night we remembered who we were. In the official timelines of World War II, the event never earned a footnote. But in the lives it touched, both American and Japanese, it marked the beginning of something far greater than victory. It was a seed of empathy planted in the soil of destruction, left to grow in silence. And as the ships carried the women home across the Pacific, the sea itself seemed to mirror that fragile balance. Calm above, deep and unhealed below. When the women of Camp Number 14 reached Japan, the homeland they stepped into was almost unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. Train stations were choked with refugees. Food was scarce, and the government, newly reorganized under Allied occupation, struggled to feed a population that had survived on rationing and silence. For the returnees, survival carried its own punishment. Many were met with suspicion, even rejection. Former soldiers and civilians who had been captured were considered haji no ko, children of shame. Neighbors whispered. Employers hesitated. Families changed the subject when they spoke of them. Most of the women chose not to speak of Luzon at all. Their experience had no place in a society rebuilding itself on pride and denial. They were not heroes nor martyrs. They were witnesses to something that Japan, in 1946, was not yet ready to understand, that kindness could exist on the other side of defeat. Yet a few of them wrote quietly, in notebooks and diaries that would only surface decades later. One entry from a former Red Cross nurse, found in the archives of Tokyo University, read, "At first I thought the Americans mocked us, but when I saw their faces, I knew they were trying to remember goodness. They were healing too." That sentence captured a truth deeper than diplomacy. Both sides, in their own ways, had been broken by the same war. The Christmas at Luzon had not been about reconciliation. It had been about recovery. In the years that followed, Japan transformed under American occupation. Roads, schools, industries, and, perhaps most importantly, ideals, were rebuilt. General MacArthur's administration encouraged a new constitution that enshrined peace as a national identity. But beneath the grand reforms, healing often began in places like that camp. in human gestures that never made headlines. Former American officers, now retired, occasionally mentioned such episodes in memoirs and letters. Chaplain Keller returned to Illinois and spent his later years serving at a small parish. When asked once, during an interview in 1962, if he believed his time in the Pacific had changed anything, he smiled faintly and said, "No one remembers sermons, but they remember how you treated them." Captain Hayes was less sentimental. In a 1957 Veterans Reunion, he summarized it in his dry military tone. "We gave them gifts. They gave us back a bit of our humanity. That's all that really happened." But history would disagree. Small acts like the one at Luzon became the unwritten foundation of post-war trust between two nations once consumed by hate. Within a decade, the United States and Japan would become allies, bound not only by treaties, but by mutual respect rebuilt from the ruins of moral exhaustion. In 1985, a Japanese journalist tracing stories of women POWs located one of the last surviving members of Camp No. 14, an elderly woman named Keiko Matsumura, who lived quietly near Kyoto. When shown an old, grainy photograph of the camp's Christmas night, she touched the image with trembling hands and whispered, "I still remember the smell of chocolate." Her story was published in a small magazine under the title, "The Night Enemies Shared Gifts." It did not go viral, nor did it change policy, but among scholars of post-war reconciliation, it was cited as a rare primary account of emotional disarmament, a moment where empathy became strategy. When Keiko died in 1989, her family found inside her drawer a small bar of soap wrapped in paper so fragile it had turned yellow. On the back, in fading English letters, were the words, "Merry Christmas, 1945. That soap, like the memory it carried, had never been used. The Americans never built monuments to that night, and the Japanese never officially recorded it. Yet the story endured in the quiet corners of history, in photographs, diaries, and the unspoken gratitude of those who had once believed mercy was impossible. The war had ended with surrender, but peace, real peace, began in moments like that, when enemies dared to be human again. History often remembers wars through their explosions, through the names of battles, the number of dead, and the signatures on treaties. Yet the true measure of civilization is rarely found in victory or surrender. It hides instead in the quiet, almost invisible gestures that happen after the noise stops. The moments when humanity hesitates, and then chooses compassion. The Christmas of 1945 at Luzon was one such moment. It did not change the outcome of the war, nor appear in any official record of diplomacy. But for those who lived it, it altered the texture of memory itself. In that small camp, mercy was no longer propaganda, and hatred no longer sacred. The gifts exchanged across the wire did not symbolize triumph. They symbolized survival, not of nations but of conscience. Acts like these rarely echo through history books, but they ripple through the generations. The soldiers who handed over those parcels carried the memory home, passing it quietly to families who would grow up in the peace they helped create. The women who received them carried that same peace across an ocean, to a country still afraid of kindness. Years later, when America and Japan became allies, the world marveled at the transformation. But it had already begun. Not in embassies or treaties, but in barracks like Camp No. 14, where a few soldiers decided that mercy would be their final act of discipline. In every war, there are those who fight to destroy, and those who struggle to remain human while doing it. The men and women at Luzon chose the latter. Their courage was quiet, their faith unrecorded, yet their gesture became proof that empathy can outlive ideology, that even in the wreckage of total war, decency can rise like smoke from the ruins. Peace, when it finally came, was not born in speeches or tribunals. It began with small packages passed through wire, with trembling hands that had once aimed weapons, and eyes that had learned at last to recognize each other. That night, Christmas ceased to be a holiday of one nation. It became something greater, a moment when humanity remembered itself.